You're listening to Simply Put, a podcast from FHN Financial. I'm your host, Will Comperl. We've got a special bonus episode for you today on tariffs. Professor Amit Khandelwal of Yale University has done some really important research on the economic impacts of the 2018 tariffs, and I was glad to have the opportunity to interview him about the dynamics of tariffs and what the effects could be from this year's changes to trade policy. The interview was completed before President Trump's April 2nd announcement of new tariffs, so we kept the discussion broad instead of getting into specifics. The tariff policy landscape will continue to evolve, so I think this conversation will give a helpful foundation for understanding the economic effects as time goes on. All right, on to the interview. Our guest today is Amit Khandelwal, Professor of Global Affairs and Economics at Yale University. Amit, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Our discussion today will be all about tariffs, looking at the 2018 tariffs during the first Trump term and how they can help us understand the impacts of any new tariffs that happen this year. So I think it can be confusing to read the news and get a firm grasp on what the goals are for some of these tariffs. So Amit, to best understand the argument in support of tariffs, whether this is a devil's advocate position or actually your position, what would you say is the best case scenario in the eyes of tariff proponents? What do tariffs achieve, and what are the economic dynamics to get there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's kind of two broad reasons for why a country might want to put on tariffs from an economic perspective. So the first has to do with the fact that raising tariffs effectively is going to raise the price of imports, and that's going to be beneficial to domestic producers who are competing with foreign competitors. And so if you put a tariff on imports, then your consumers in your market might be more inclined to buy domestic goods, and that might spur domestic production. And at the outset, that sounds like it would be a good idea, but note that this is raising prices for consumers, something that we could come back to in a moment. But in a case where this could potentially work is that maybe you have kind of an infant industry or a nascent industry that you're trying to promote. It might be beneficial to have some protection around that industry as it's trying to grow. And if you were able to protect it for a certain amount of time, maybe it can become mature enough to be a competitive, not only within the country, but maybe globally. And that might enable you to kind of launch into a new industry. And that historically has been a reason that countries in the past have tried to use tariffs. It's sometimes called an infant industry protection argument. So that's potentially one reason for using tariffs. The other reason is a little bit more subtle, which has to do with the fact that a large country like the United States might be able to shift some of the burden of who pays the tariff onto the foreign countries. So the way this could work is, imagine we're importing a good from China, say it's $100 worth. We're going to impose a tariff of, say, 20%. And so a few things could happen to the after tariff price once the tariff goes into effect. In one extreme, the importer and the exporter kind of keep the price stays at $100. The before tariff price stays at $100. But then after you impose the tariff of 20%, the importer has to pay $100 to the exporter and then pays 20% or $20 to the U.S. government. And so kind of the after tariff price of that import is $120. But there's kind of another extreme that could happen, which is that maybe the importer has a lot of market power over the foreign exporter. Maybe the importer says, well, I'm not going to buy from you if now the all-in price is going to be $120. I want you to lower your before tariff price. And so maybe in the extreme, the exporter lowers its price to, say, $80. And so now the after tariff price is going to be roughly the same as what it was prior to the imposition of the tariff. And so in that situation, the price that the U.S. economy is seeing is still roughly $100, and effectively the foreign countries or the foreign exporters have eaten the cost of the tariff. And so that's a situation where we've referred to this in economics as a terms of trade shift, where the U.S. is imposing its market power on the foreign country and has been able to lower the before tariff price. And in that situation, the tariffs can actually be a pure gain for the United States because there's effectively no change in price, but the foreign countries are effectively paying the tariffs. And that's another kind of textbook reason why a tariff might be advantageous from an economic perspective. But of course, it all kind of comes down to the devils of the details and whether that actually occurs. And again, something we can talk about what actually happened in the previous tariff episode in 2018 and 2019.
I think that's a great way to put it. The devils are in the details, because I think sometimes people speak about the cost benefits of tariffs in such broad terms, but so many things can factor into it, which is bargaining power of the countries, whether we're trying to support a specific domestic industry, or if the US, for example, even has the ability to produce something they're enacting a tariff on. We can't produce coffee. It's just impossible, so we don't really have that much flexibility to support domestic producers. Now, going to the other side, echoing Adam Smith and David Ricardo and, what I think is usually considered textbook economics, what is the high-level argument against tariffs? Can you just give our listeners the nuts and bolts of why there are gains from trade and why, the typical U.S. consumer or even U.S. producer would benefit from having access to foreign markets?
Let's walk through how a tariff propagates through an economy. And then maybe this can kind of lay out why kind of the classic textbook models kind of would predict that kind of a free trade or low tariff barriers are going to be beneficial for an economy. When you're engaging in trade, imagine you impose a tariff on a foreign country. And as we said, walked in that previous example, this is potentially going to raise the prices of goods for consumers. How much the prices go up depends on, as we talked about, how much of that tariff gets fully passed on to the consumer prices or not. Now, that's going to be a loss to consumers. So consumers are going to face higher prices. They're going to buy less of that good, or maybe change where they're sourcing that good to potentially another kind of higher cost producer as a result. Now, as we talked about, domestic producers might be better off, but how much they're better off depends on the extent to which consumers are going to substitute towards those goods. If, as you said, if American producers just can't compete with the good that's been tariffed, then the consumer has no choice but to continue to buy from the overseas producer at a potentially higher price. But even if they can compete, there's kind of a couple of offsetting effects that could happen, which would kind of blunt the gains to domestic producers. So on the one hand, domestic producers are not operating in a vacuum. They're also operating in a global environment, and they're potentially using imported intermediate components that are used for the production of their goods. When you impose a tariff, you're potentially also raising the costs for your domestic producers, which is going to blunt any benefit that they get from the protection. The second reason, of course, is that our trade partners are not likely to sit silently. And if you impose tariffs on their goods, they will impose tariffs on your goods. And so, to the extent that your producers are engaged in producing for the globe, there's going to be a lower demand for domestic producers' goods from foreigners. And so both of those two effects are going to kind of offset any potential benefit from the tariffs that you impose. And so while the government still does collect some revenue, what we generally find, both in kind of the classbook textbook cases, but also in a bulk of empirical work that's been done over the past several decades, is that there's going to be some losses to consumers, there's going to be some gains to producers, there's going to be some tariff revenue collected, but on net, there's going to be an overall loss to the economy. And the reason has to do with the fact that prices are going up. And when prices are going up, there's going to be a set of transactions that are no longer taking place in the economy because of the fact that prices are now higher. And economists generally refer to that as a deadweight loss. But that's a loss to the economy relative to what the economy would have had there not any tariffs in place.
Let's talk now about the 2018 tariffs. So what products and countries did they apply to?
In 2018, the trade war actually unfolded over the course of 2 years, so from about February of 2018 to September of 2019. And initially, it was targeted towards particular sets of products, so washing machines, solar panels, aluminum and steel. And what the U.S. did was they imposed tariffs on most countries producing those goods. But by the summer and fall of 2018, this kind of quickly shifted towards raising tariffs on goods from China. And over the course of 4 or 5 tariff waves from the fall of 2018 to the fall of 2019, the US systematically raised tariffs on Chinese goods, and China retaliated by raising tariffs on US goods. By the end of the 2019 period, what effectively happened was that the US and China kind of were collectively raising tariffs on just shy of $500 billion worth of trade. To put that number in some perspective, the US ended up raising tariffs on about 20% of its imports, or about 2.5% of total GDP. China basically targeted and raised tariffs on about 10% of its own imports. It's about 3.5% of its GDP. What do those numbers mean? A lot of people often make, or these days are making comparisons to the 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariffs, where tariffs were raised pretty dramatically on imports by Congress back then. The amount of products that were affected by tariff hikes under Smoot-Hawley was just below 2%. So by this perspective, actually, the U.S. The trade war was actually quite. The more recent trade war was bigger. Of course, tariffs are much larger back then, but it was a pretty sizable fraction of imports that were affected by tariffs. And I think by the end of it, you could basically say that 3/4 of all products that came from China were being hit by an increase in tariffs of about 15 to 20%.
So if we go back to our kind of two different schools of thought about the pros and cons of tariffs, what has your research or other research that you've seen concluded about the impacts of these specific tariffs on U.S. consumer prices, employment, and consumption?
Let's first talk about that terms of trade channel and did it potentially happen? So it's a very simple empirical exercise one can do, where you can just look at imports coming into the United States. We buy products, or goods are classified into about 15,000 different products. Many of those products, the Chinese imports of those goods were now facing tariffs. And so you could look at the prices of Chinese goods compared to the prices of other countries' goods in those same products over time. And what we basically found was that the prices of Chinese goods were going up by the full extent of the tariffs. So now, again, going back to that example, the $100 import that we were buying, and we were imposing a tariff of 20%, the after tariff price was now $120. So it wasn't the case that the foreign countries were bearing the incidence of that tariff. They weren't lowering their prices so that the after tariff price kind of remained the same. Effectively, they were not changing the tariffs at all. And so U.S. consumers were really taking it on the chin. So, we basically find that the prices of imports were going up by the amount of the tariffs. Now, that's potentially beneficial to domestic producers, kind of like the whole reason, as we talked about, that you might want to protect, or you might want to use it. One of the reasons you might want to use a tariff is, okay, you're going to raise prices for consumers, but that should hopefully make your domestic producers better off. And so here, what the research has generally found was that it is true that domestic producers did get some benefit from the protection, but it was kind of completely unwound by those two other forces that I mentioned. So we find that domestic producers got some benefit from protection, but the fact that they are integrated into global value chains meant that the costs of their inputs were also going up because those were also tariffed, and foreign countries were retaliating. And given how important the Chinese market is for many American companies now, both of those effects kind of offset the any potential benefits. And so if you just look at a time series of manufacturing employment in the United States, there's basically no gain and no loss in U.S. manufacturing. It kind of continues on this trend line, kind of pre-war. And so kind of the overall conclusion seems to come out from the research seems that prices were higher for consumers. There was no real benefit for domestic producers. And so it was kind of a net loss to the U.S. economy.
I think in a lot of ways, whenever there is, a tariff really feels like a tax increase by another name. And as we all know, when you increase taxes on something, households and businesses can really find a way to avoid them, some ways lawfully and some ways not. But I know that there was a spike in imports to the U.S. from Vietnam in 2018. So are you aware of any kind of measurable behavior where Chinese importers, to get around this U.S. tariff, they would just reroute some things through Vietnam, which had a different relationship with the U.S.?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, some of the work that I've done has looked exactly at what has happened to what we would call bystander countries, so countries other than China. We're kind of sitting on the sidelines watching these two great superpowers tariff each other. And it's exactly kind of what you were suggesting, which is we do see that there are certain countries, Vietnam is one, Cambodia is another, Mexico is another, that seem to increase their exports to the United States and sort of fill in the gap that the U.S. is, right, to fill in the gap that China is losing as a result of the tariffs. And so that's one way to think about that, is that the consumers are able to find a potential, maybe not the least cost supplier, but maybe the second least cost supplier now in Vietnam or Cambodia or Mexico. And so that's going to blunt the effect of the tariffs. But of course, this means that the potential benefit to the producers in the US is going to be lower as well. Now, how much of that is kind of legal versus illegal was hard for us to say, since we didn't actually see kind of the micro level, firm level exports. But some of the research that I've seen has found that, there was a significant amount of foreign investment coming from China, where Chinese firms are now opening up production facilities in Vietnam and Mexico and so forth, potentially to work around that. So, one way to think about that might be a legal way around the tariff restrictions. Some people claim that there was illegal kind of just restamping of, where the product is made. Difficult for me to assess that.
Sure, but it's I guess just helpful to think conceptually that the trade finds a path of least resistance, and just because there is a tariff implemented, it doesn't mean that everything happens in kind of the ideal conceptual textbook way.
Correct. So the fact that there are multiple suppliers of a given product means that, again, if you tariff China, it doesn't all come back to the United States. It's going to, as you said, go to kind of the least cost producer, the second least cost producer, which may be overseas. And that's what actually, I guess maybe we'll come to that in a moment, but that's what makes the potential effects of the more recent tariff announcements that we've seen kind of quite different from what we saw before, whereas, in 2018 and 2019, it was largely a trade war that was being fought between U.S. and China.
So we are going to get to that in just a second. I do want to segue from this kind of 2018 episode of Tariffs to the current one, trying to think about the overlap in one major secondary impact, which is just the collateral damage from these tariffs. So outside of just the increase in prices, you're talking about households and businesses that now need to really recalibrate their decision making in terms of supply chains, what they're going to decide to buy for certain things, where they're going to get it. And do you have an idea of how that collateral damage reduced output and investment? We saw from the pandemic, when there are disruptions to what's available, that adjustment doesn't happen without friction.
I think there's a few ways in which we saw this playing out over the past 5 years. So the first is that the increased geopolitical tensions that kind of commenced around the mid-aughts, we have seen now that companies are trying to adopt a China plus one strategy. And so companies, I think the trade war definitely triggered this, are starting to think about relocating production in other parts of the world. Now, this doesn't happen seamlessly. And so there was a reason that the supply chains were stretched to be efficient by sourcing from China. That made prices lower. If you're now going to dual source products from China and Vietnam, or China and India, that's going to raise prices. It's going to raise companies' costs, which they're going to pass on to consumers. But we have seen companies do this. For example, Apple now is increasingly sourcing more of their iPhones from India, something that people didn't think was likely to be possible, or at least likely to be possible so quickly. And so that's one way in which companies are adapting. They are trying to mitigate rising geopolitical tensions in this way. There was another more subtle way, which is actually, I think, kind of an interesting way in which companies and consumers responded to the trade war. So the U.S. has a very interesting quirk in its trade policy, which allows shipments under $800 to enter into the country free of tariffs and your usual customs paperwork burden that you have to fill out when importing goods. And this is known as a de minimis import channel, and it's called de minimis since it's historically been quite small. But in the past few years, we've seen like a rocketing of shipments and packages that are being sent through this channel. And so if you think about the way that Walmart or Amazon typically imports goods, so what do? They try to anticipate demands for TVs or T-shirts, and they place orders from their suppliers from overseas. They bring those products into large shipments. They now face tariffs if they're coming from China. They store them in their inventory in warehouses, domestic warehouses, or at the retail shop. And when you place order on Amazon, that package gets shipped to you within a day or so. that shipping of the package is a domestic shipment. It's going from a warehouse, outside of New Haven, where I'm located, to my home. In the past 5-6 years, there's really been a big logistics revolution where companies have also figured out how to get goods directly from the factory overseas to the consumer. And so you kind of disintermediate the intermediary, like the warehouse and so forth. And so what this has meant is that if the shipment is now under $800, it can come in without any tariffs or without paying your typical customs fees and so forth. And there's been a huge surge in shipments, which in last year was about $65 billion worth of shipments, over 1.4 billion packages coming into the US. Any listeners have purchased items on AliExpress, Temu, or Shein. These are really large retailers now. They are buying a product through this de minimis package. And that's one mechanism through which consumers and producers, again, try to avoid the consequences of the tariffs, again, in a legal way. But then, again, as we can talk, that particular channel is also on the chopping block at the moment. And so that's likely to be restricted now going forward.
Yeah, as we talk about this new episode of Tariffs, let's start with that de minimis situation in the law. Is that being proposed to change? So is there a proposal to change that to make sure that importers can't circumvent the bigger tariffs, or is it falling under the radar for now?
Yeah, so actually the Biden administration last fall took steps to basically remove the exemption for Chinese imports. And the Trump administration back in February 1st kind of went through and rescinded the access to the de minimis channel for Chinese goods. But what had happened was within a couple of days, the Postal Service was overwhelmed with the responsibility of trying to collect tariffs on hundreds of thousands of packages a day. And so that currently is paused while I believe they get their systems into place in order to collect the tariff revenue. We're likely to see this channel go away. I think there's very little appetite on both sides of the aisle to have a provision of U.S. trade policy where certain types of imports are subject to tariffs while other types of imports are not. But one of the things that we found in our work is that it's the lower income consumers who particularly use or purchase products through the de minimis channel from platforms like Shein and Temu. They're particularly low cost providers of lots of consumer goods. And so any restriction or removal of access to the de minimis channel will, based on the work that we've done, look like a regressive tax and raise the cost for lower income consumers.
You talked a little bit before about how it looks like this year's tariffs will be broader instead of just targeted at a country like China. Now, I don't want to get into too many specifics because there is the risk that by the time we even finish this phone call, there will be a new tariff policy announced. And so that certainly doesn't bode well for the relevance by the time this episode is published. But I think we can still make certain assumptions about what tariff policy is going to look like this year. So how are you seen the Trump administration's approach this time around as different from in 2018?
I think one of the main things that I see as different is, well, I guess two main things. So one is that we're seeing now an expansion of the use of tariffs, not just on China and a potential geopolitical adversary, but also on allies, which I think has surprised many analysts. And this is extended not just to Canada and Mexico, which has been in the news, but as you said, it remains to be seen what will happen, but it's quite possible by the end of next week, we will have much higher tariffs on many of our trade partners. And I think that's been surprising to see this expansion. And that's related to the second thing, which I think is quite different, which is, in the 2018-2019 tariffs, the Trump administration, prior to implementing those tariffs, did undergo a fairly comprehensive review of China's trade practices and filed a Section 301 this was an aspect of U.S. trade law allows the U.S. or the U.S. executive to impose tariffs on countries that are kind of engaging in unfair trade practices. And so in order to justify the 2018-2019 tariffs, the Trump administration went through a large exercise to document many unfair trade practices that China had been using through subsidies and domestic price supports and so forth. So here, what we're seeing since Trump's second term is a willingness to kind of use other demands in other domains to potentially, justify the tariffs, such as trying to get support on geopolitical issues. I think trying to change trade deficits. These are not necessarily the typical reasons for why we've seen tariffs in the past. And so I think it's kind of an expansion of the rationale behind the tariffs, which I think has caught lots of people off guard. And I think has caught lots of other countries off guard as to not knowing precisely what can be done to avoid the consequences of the U.S. putting tariffs on its exports.
Now you touched on this a little bit about the legal authority that the executive branch can have, and as far as I understand, some of these have been implemented under the guise of wartime or emergency powers, and we're not under threat from Canada, I would say. So is there a chance that some of these are overturned in the courts and need legislative authority? If the court system does decide that, will businesses already just say, well, we don't want to deal with this headache, and we've already switched our supply chains? Do you have any sense of how households and businesses are approaching that idea that some of these things could be overturned by the courts?
Yeah, so I won't weigh in on whether it will be overturned or not. That I'm not an expert on. But I think, if you're putting yourself in the shoes of a manufacturing company in the United States, trying to gauge this, I don't know. I think there's two things that come to mind. So one is we're clearly in a period of volatility in trade. And so when things are uncertain, the natural thing to do is to keep things on hold. So potential investments are likely to fall. I mean, I think this is why you see the stock market fall when tariffs or new tariffs are potentially announced. It's because the stock market is trying to price in all future investments and the productive, ability of productive outcomes of companies. And so that's what we're seeing, when the market reacts. But it's not obvious to me that it's going to be the case that you will just reshore everything back into the United States, because I think what we're seeing at the moment is something that's very idiosyncratic to the current administration. And so if you're going to reshore everything back to the United States, you also want certainty that maybe the tariffs that we're going to be imposing on Canada and Mexico are going to remain in the long run. Because if they're not going to remain in the long run, then maybe just sit this period out. Going back to this, what is the potential benefit, or what parts of the tariff of a tariff policy are potentially beneficial to the U.S., trying to shift production back to the U.S., it's not obvious to me that this is going to happen. I think we've seen some evidence of it. There's some anecdotal reports of companies opening up production facilities, but I think the jury's still out in the aggregate of whether this happens.
Now, earlier you mentioned how, of course, most countries do not just sit idly by when the U.S. implements these tariffs, and so there can be retaliatory tariffs. And then I wonder, especially given how unpredictable those trade policies have been the first couple months of the new administration, is it possible that other countries will respond to these tariffs and there will be this endless cascade of retaliation? And I mostly bring this up for our listeners. Federal Reserve policy is really top of mind, and so far Fed officials have said any tariffs are going to be transitory. So it's going to be a one-off price increase, and then they can look past it. But if you do have a cascade of retaliation, counter-retaliation, and this negative feedback loop, does it mean you just kind of keep having little price increases over time?
Yeah, I think that's a certain risk. I mean, I personally find the debate over whether the tariffs cause inflation hard to pin down, because, as you said, it's a one-time price effect. But if that one-time price effect, if it happens gradually over many months versus 1 month, do you call that inflation or not? But I think it's clear from the past data that price levels are likely to rise. And as you said, we can get into this back and forth, often tit for tat trade war, where the U.S. imposes tariffs, countries retaliate, the U.S. retaliates further. And I think we're going to, in that situation, we can end up in a world where overall output, in the globe or in any given country is lower with the same amount of resources. So lower world productivity. There's kind of a shifting of jobs from more productive parts of the economy to potentially less productive parts of the economy. And I think that this is a pretty bad outcome. And I think this is also related to the fact that I'm not sure that it's clear what would stop the tit for tat. And so I think as tariffs potentially keep getting threatened with no clear explanation for why it's coming into place, this is a highly uncertain period.
We've talked about how the approach of tariffs in 2018 is pretty different than what looks to be the case this year. But I think it's also important to note that the economy in 2018 was much different than we have right now. And so I want to ask a final question that is a bit more speculative, perhaps. But do you think that in the current state, the U.S. economy will be able to withstand these tariffs and the potential tit for tat, considering the idea that, the Fed is still very vigilant in keeping interest rates high to fight that last mile of high inflation, but also, even though the labor market looks okay and the unemployment rate has been just about 4%, things feel very fragile. So in 2018, it seemed like the U.S. economy was set up to be resilient to a lot of those shocks. Do you think that is the same case now, or could it be more sensitive to these adjustments? And I understand, this is looking into your crystal ball, but what is your sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think by and large, the U.S. is still a relatively closed economy. So, if I said that, let's just imagine we ran the same exercise in tariffs that we saw last time, which was large but targeted tariffs on China. I think the U.S. face higher tariffs. We would go through the mechanisms that we kind of discussed earlier. And I think the U.S. economy would kind of weather that without much issue. But now when we're talking about really pretty broad swaths of imports being hit with tariffs, if that goes into effect, potential retaliations, potential implications on the dollar, which are things that something that we didn't cover much here. I think this is maybe a slightly different world than we were back in 2018, 2019. And the way that I also like to think about this is a lot of decisions for consumers, decisions for producers are all made on the back of expectations. Maybe you're not worried about tariffs because you are maybe working for a tech company. But if you're selling your product to a manufacturing company that's now being affected by the tariffs, that can spill over, that can adjust your expectations down. I think we're then in a much more kind of, as you said, in a fragile place. And so the more volatility around tariffs, as well as the potential broader kind of swath in which we may be targeting tariffs across imports, I think makes us different from last time.
Amit Khandelwal, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
This podcast is presented for informational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase or sale of any security. Views expressed herein accurately reflect the speaker's personal views about the data, news, trends, events, etc. discussed herein or any subject securities or issuers. No part of their compensation was, is, or will be, directly or indirectly, related to any specific recommendations or views expressed. FHN Financial, through First Horizon Bank or its affiliates, offers investment products and services. Investment products are not FDIC insured, have no bank guarantee, and may lose value.